cheers, everyone. Thank you for joining me. I am Dave Brown, and this is The New Populist. Well, on thehill.com, there was an article published a few days ago that was written by RFK Jr. and Donald Trump Jr. concerning the very real possibility that the conflict in Ukraine could turn nuclear if we are not careful, if we continue to escalate. Now, people in the U.S. foreign policy establishment pretend like this is not a real issue. They think it's overblown, and even some of them even have said that if we were to have a preemptive nuclear strike against Russia, it'll be okay, and that Russia, for some reason, wouldn't retaliate. Now, of course, this is absolute craziness. If either side were to launch a nuclear weapon, it would lead to the entire world being destroyed. It would be total nuclear war. There is no limited nuclear strike. Yet some people in the West think that's a possibility. Now, again, these people are crazy. They are completely underplaying how dangerous things are right now. And this is why RFK Jr. and Donald Trump Jr. are trying to sound the alarm with this article. But of course, with anything that is not 100% pro-Ukraine, not 100% toning the line, most of the mainstream media ignores it. So this article has been ignored by most people, except for online, where you have these NAFO types attacking the two of them for being pro-Russian propagandists. Now, you know what's funny about Russian propaganda? They never actually define what it is. They just say, oh, that's Russian propaganda. Well, what exactly? Please specifically state what the propaganda is. And they can never do that. Why? Because a lot of what's said is not Russian propaganda. It's actually truth. So that's one thing that's really irritating about that claim of Russian propaganda. It is never defined. And secondly, I will say this too about this war. I want people who are against any negotiation to define victory and how it will be achieved. Now, some will say victory is when the Russians are driven out of the Donbass and Crimea. Well, okay, that would be victory. Give me a plausible, keyword, plausible scenario where the Russians are driven out of the Donbass and Crimea. Can you do that? It's been 2.5 years. Ukraine has lost probably 500,000 men. They are grabbing guys off the street because they have manpower shortages. Russia continues to advance in the Donbass. So how can you plausibly give me a scenario where the Ukrainians can drive Russia out of the Donbass and Crimea? They can't. So how do you get to victory? And if you can't get to victory, what is the point of continuing to prolong this fight where you have so many Ukrainians dying? You will never hear anybody who is pro-Ukraine, who was accusing people of spreading Russian propaganda. You'll never hear them actually, again, explain how this victory is going to take place. They never do. They just say, just keep on giving more weapons. Just keep escalating. We need long-range weapons, blah, blah, blah. But they'll never actually explain how this is going to happen, how this victory will be achieved. Now, on the topic of long-range weapons, that's been talked about recently. Thankfully, Biden shot that down, no pun intended, and said that we're not going to provide or okay the use of long-range weapons to strike deeper into Russia. Now, that's good and all, but I have a suspicion that the real issue is that the British made such a big deal out of okaying the use of these missiles into Russia that it brought too much visibility. One thing that the Western politicians rely on, specifically U.S. politicians like Biden and Blinken, they rely on the ignorance of the American people. So if we announce that we're going to allow Ukraine to strike Moscow with U.S. weapons, and then Russia retaliates, it's harder for them, the U.S. politicians, to somehow claim that what Russia did was unprovoked. That's key there, unprovoked. Everything Russia does is unprovoked. So I think that the United States wouldn't mind the use of these missiles against Russia, but we got to do it quietly. So if Russia does retaliate, they can fool the American public into thinking that Russia had no right to do so. So be on the lookout. It's for now, it's for now not going to happen, but I suspect in the future they may change that policy and allow those long-range strikes into Russia, but perhaps they won't announce it and give it visibility, which would allow Putin to retaliate and say, "Hey, you guys said you okayed this, and we retaliated, so it's not our fault." So that's what might happen in the future. So keep an eye on that. Now, let me read this article. It's not too long. Makes a lot of sense, and you're not going to hear it again from the mainstream media because they do not want to talk about anything that makes sense and is Russian propaganda. So, negotiate with Moscow to end the Ukrainian war and prevent nuclear devastation. Yeah, that'll be good. The New York Times reported Thursday that the Biden administration is considering allowing Ukraine to use NATO-provided long-range precision weapons against targets deep inside Russia. Such a decision would put the world at greater risk of nuclear conflagration than any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis. At a time when American leaders should be focused on finding a diplomatic off-ramp to a war that should never have been allowed to take place, the Biden-Harris administration is instead pursuing a policy that Russia says it will interpret as an act of war. In the words of Vladimir Putin, long-range strikes in Russia will mean that NATO countries, the United States and European countries, are at war with Russia. Now, Ukraine is already striking deep into Russia with drones. The difference, though, is with these weapons will require U.S. contractors to be involved in the targeting of these weapons into Russia. So that's how it's different. So it would directly involve the United States. So Ukraine can't launch these missiles by themselves. And that's the distinction between that and other weapon systems like drones that have been going into Russia. This one would require the direct involvement of the U.S., which, as Putin rightly says, would be an act of war by the U.S. or NATO against Russia. Some American analysts believe Putin is bluffing and favor calling his bluff. As the Times reported, easing the restrictions on Western weapons will not cause Moscow to escalate. 17 former ambassadors and generals wrote in a letter to the administration this week. We know this because Ukraine is already striking territory Russia considers its own, including Crimea and Kursk, with these weapons, and Moscow's response remains unchanged. These analysts are mistaking restraint for weakness. In essence, they are advocating a strategy of brinksmanship. Each escalation, from HIMARS to cluster munitions to Abrams tanks to F-16s to ATACMS, draws the world closer to the brink of Armageddon. Their logic seems to be that if you go to bear 5 times and it doesn't respond, it is safe to go to them even harder a 6th time. Now, as you point out here, they already are striking into Russia. But as I said earlier, there's a difference. The weapons they're using right now, again, are weapons they can use by themselves. The other missiles require our direct involvement. So, again, that is the distinction between the two. Such a strategy might be reasonable if the bear has no teeth. The hawks in the Biden administration seem to have forgotten that Russia is a nuclear power. They have forgotten the wisdom of John F. Kennedy, who said in 1963, nuclear powers must avert those confrontations which bring an adversary to a choice of either a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war. We should take this advice seriously. Putin has signaled numerous times that Russia would use nuclear weapons in extreme circumstances. In September 2022, Putin said, "If the territorial integrity of our country is threatened, we will, without doubt, use all available means to protect Russia and our people. This is not a bluff." In March 2023, he struck a deal with Belarus to station tactical nuclear weapons there. Earlier this month, Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov, I hope I pronounced that right, announced that Russia would be amending its nuclear doctrine in response to Western involvement in the Ukraine war. Imagine if Russia were providing another country with missiles, training, and targeting information to strike deep into American territory. The U.S. would never tolerate it. We shouldn't expect Russia to tolerate it either. Let me stop right there. That is the one thing about us, the United States, that drives me crazy. Our complete inability to put ourselves in the other person's shoes. Imagine there were missiles based somewhere in Mexico being fired into the United States, hitting places in California or Texas or Colorado. Could you imagine that for a second? And if these missiles were provided by China or Russia, and they were giving the Mexican army the targeting information to fire into our cities? To even imagine that is insane. It will just never happen. Yet we do that to other countries, and we're shocked when they might actually retaliate and do something back. Again, this whole war was about the United States wanting to extend NATO to Ukraine, wanting to have a puppet government in Ukraine that would acquiesce to U.S. demands. The New York Times admitted right after the coup in 2014, what did we do? We immediately put CIA bases on the Ukraine-Russian border. Imagine Mexico, U.S. border, Chinese spy bases. Would we allow that? Of course not. And it's not just these spy bases. As Victoria Nuland testified, we have, as she said, biological research facilities that would be dangerous if they fell into Russian hands. So there you have Russia. They're looking over. They see this coup backed by the United States. After the coup, the CIA puts bases on the border, and we move in biological research facilities. What do you expect Russia to do? What would we do? Well, if that was Mexico-United States border, it would never happen. Even the smallest inkling of China or Russia being involved in Mexico, we would shut it down. But again, our hypocrisy. We do not look at Russia or China and say, how would they feel about this? What is their rational response as a country with pride and a country that doesn't want to be bullied? We never do that. And that's going to lead us into trouble. It already has. We have to change our thinking. But unfortunately, neocons don't change their thinking. They keep on plowing forward. But let me continue. This game of nuclear chicken has gone far enough. There is no remaining step between firing U.S. missiles deep into Russian territory and a nuclear exchange. We cannot get any closer to the brink than this. And for what? To weaken Russia, to control Ukraine's minerals. No vital American interest is at stake. To risk nuclear conflict for the sake of the neoconservative fantasy of global full spectrum dominance is madness. And they are 100% right. It's about this neoconservative fantasy of complete control of the world. Never stepping back, always trying to conquer any great power out there that they view as a threat to the United States. But the problem is there's nuclear weapons. China has nuclear weapons, Russia does, and you push hard enough and you might trigger that nuclear war. And that is, again, the whole concern of this article. And the last couple paragraphs here, the war fever in the U.S. foreign policy establishment is at such a pitch that it is hard to tell whether they believe their own rhetoric. I think they do, actually. In last Tuesday's debate, Vice President Kamala Harris conjured up images of Russian forces rolling across Europe. Surely she must know how absurd that is. For one thing, Russia can barely wrest a few provinces from Ukraine, which is by no means one of Europe's great powers. Secondly, Russia made its war aims very clear at the outset, most notably Ukrainian neutrality and a halt to NATO's eastward expansion. Hundreds of thousands of lost lives and hundreds of billions of dollars later, no one is better off. Not Europe, not America, and certainly not Ukraine. It is past time to de-escalate this conflict. This is more important than any of the political issues our nation argues about. Nuclear war would mean the end of civilization as we know it, maybe even the end of the human species. And they're right. We can argue about abortion. We can argue about LGBTQ plus issues. We can argue about all these things. But we have nuclear war. None of that matters. We're all dead. And so we need to very seriously pay attention to what's going on and understand that this threat is real. Again, but unfortunately, our politicians, they don't seem to think it is. They're not concerned at all, and they should be. But last couple of things here. They mentioned that Kamala Harris talked about Russia marching across Europe, and I've talked about it before in the past. Russia has spent 2.5 years trying to secure the Donbass, and they haven't. What threat are they to march across Europe? With what army? How are they going to do that? The idea of them marching into Poland or anywhere else is ridiculous. Putin wants this conflict over. He wants to go back to worrying about the economy in Russia. He does not want to conquer all of Ukraine and then march across into Poland and into Western Europe. So Kamala Harris mentioned that. Of course, we know she's an idiot, and she's repeating the talking points given to her by her neoconservative handlers, and that's why she said it. She has no real beliefs on Ukraine. She is just repeating what she's been told to repeat. And they talk about here NATO's expansion eastward. That's what Russia doesn't want. And that's true. They don't want that. So if we ever sat down and negotiated and said, okay, we're not going to expand NATO to Ukraine, we can have some neutrality for Ukraine, Putin would talk. And that's what he wanted before this war started, which is the whole tragedy. We've 500,000 Ukrainians dead. Ukraine's not better off. Europe's not better off. The United States is not better off. And you know what? Russia's not better off. Now, they've managed to stabilize their economy, much to the chagrin of the United States and Europe, but they themselves would have been better off not fighting this war. This war did not need to happen, and it's not benefiting anyone. And the sooner it ends, the better. And unfortunately, you got those Lindsey Grahams, you got those really sick people like Victoria Nuland who they just they just want to hurt Russia. Even if after all said and done, nothing really changes, they'll be happy if it causes Russia some trouble. Even if it costs, Ukraine, their entire country, or Ukraine, 1 million men. They don't seem to care. You will never see either one of them, Lindsey Graham or Victoria Nuland, talk about the cost of Ukraine, other than to say, in a very sick way, I would add, that Ukrainians will fight to the last Ukrainian. That's what Lindsey Graham said. That's pretty sick. And then what? They're all dead. What good did that serve them? And why does a U.S. senator in a country thousands of miles away, why is he promoting or advocating or encouraging somebody else to fight until they're all dead? And I've said before in the past to Ukrainians, why would you listen to that man? Why would you listen to somebody advocate you dying while they're sitting in D.C. in a fancy restaurant, drinking wine and eating a fine steak? Why listen to that guy? He does not have your best interest at heart. He's a neocon. His only concern is hurting Russia, not helping Ukraine. People like that should be condemned and ignored completely. But unfortunately, he's over there in Ukraine with Zelensky, shaking hands, being treated seriously, when he's in fact pushing your country over the edge. Lindsey Graham, very, very sick guy. So that's the article. RFK Jr., Donald Trump Jr., very sensible. Nuclear war is a potentiality if we're not careful. And again, watch this whole thing with the long-range missiles. It's not over. Every time we say we're not going to escalate, we do. So I fully expect at some point this issue will come back up, although quietly, and that we at some point will okay these missiles, and God knows what happens then. That's where we really need to pay attention to see how Putin responds, and that could be the last straw for him. I don't know that to be the case, but that's a possibility. And if it is, again, nuclear war, unfortunately, is a very real possibility. Well, that's it for now. If you are new to my channel, please like and subscribe, and I will see you next time.